A silent stone room holds the only copy of an idea from 2,000 years ago. That's the Medieval Scriptorium. It was a place of rescue, but also of radical change. Because saving an idea can rewrite it, the act of preservation itself changes the thing. We'll see that, how Aristotle's logic became a tool for theology. How Ptolemy's stars were mapped onto a Christian heaven. Every hand that passes a thought on leaves a fingerprint. So what does it mean to preserve something? When the act of keeping it alters it forever, the sacred silence was a defense. Outside, the world was fire, conflict, a slow forgetting. A library that stood for centuries could vanish in a night. The knowledge of generations written on papyrus or parchment was fragile. It was ephemeral, so the scriptorium wasn't just a room, it was a vault. Its mission was salvage. A desperate salvage. Each scribe was a first responder in a kind of cultural emergency. Their task was to find surviving texts. Often it was a single copy, crumbling, hidden in some forgotten corner of an older monastery. Or arriving from a distant land, and they had to replicate it before it was lost. Every page was a race against decay, a whisper pulled back from the edge of silence. That was the foundation, a rescue operation continental in scale, but in that quiet vault something began to happen. The act of saving the text started to change them. The process of copying, which seems straightforward, is where the first fingerprints were left. A scribe's hand isn't a scanner, it's an interpreter. You picture this great library slowly dissolving, not just a shelf of books. It was the whole intellectual world of antiquity, a civilization's conversation with itself, going silent. That was the cargo, Aristotle's logical frameworks, how to build a sound argument from the ground up. Galen's medical wisdom, mapping the human body long before microscopes. Ptolemy's star charts plotting the heavens, Virgil's poems, Tacitus's histories, Euclid's geometry, the accumulated light of centuries, a record of human reason, curiosity, beauty. But after the Western Roman Empire faded, the vessels for this light began to crumble. The primary medium was papyrus, a plant-based paper, beautiful but fragile. It cracks in dry air, it rots in damp. A scroll could be lost to a single fire, a flood, neglect in a forgotten corner, and there was a cultural shift. The new, rising Christian world, you didn't always see the value in pagan poetry or Greek philosophy. Some church leaders argued these works were dangerous. Distractions from spiritual truth at best, portals to error at worst, so the vast corpus of classical learning was scattered, and it was often suspect. That's the scale of the rescue mission, the survival of entire fields of study, ways of thinking about the world, hung by a thread. The thread was whether a monk in a scriptorium, hundreds of miles away and centuries later, would choose to spend 6 months of his life copying a particular text. He had to judge it worthy, the fate of reason, of science, of literature, distilled into thousands of individual decisions made in quiet rooms. The cargo was priceless. And the vessel for its journey into the future was the humble parchment page. The scribe would sit with the exemplar in front of him, and he'd copy it. That was the act of preservation, the first one, the deepest one. There were no machines to make another copy, so knowledge only lasted as long as the physical thing that held it. To fight against Oblivion, the scriptorium had one weapon, the human hand, a quill moving on a new piece of parchment. The master text, the exemplar, that was a treasure. It might be the only copy for hundreds of miles. Its pages would be thin, the ink fading. The scribe's job was to make a perfect twin, a new vessel for the same words. Before the original was lost to time, to damp, to decay, this was salvation by brute force, a quiet, heroic kind of endurance. You have to think about the scale. A complete Bible, a pandect, that was a monumental thing. It took the skins of about 250 animals. A team of scribes could work for more than a year. Every letter formed with care, every page a small masterpiece of survival. This wasn't about publishing for the masses. This was about preventing an extinction. Each new manuscript was a new node in a fragile, sprawling network, a text copied in an isolated Irish monastery at the edge of the known world could find its way over decades to a busy scriptorium in France or Germany. Each copy was a seed, planted so the species of thought wouldn't die out. Through this relentless work, this duplication that spanned generations, the scriptorium built the backbone of medieval thought. The voice of Cicero arguing for virtue, Augustine wrestling with faith and reason, Pliny describing the natural world, these weren't echoes from a tomb. They were living conversations, kept alive because thousands of anonymous hands chose to replicate them. Letter by patient letter, the library was written into existence. One painstaking copy at a time, but inside that act, that faithful reproduction, the scribe's sacred duty, was the first, most subtle mechanism for change. Because a hand isn't a machine and a mind can't help but see, but this rescue mission had a filter, an invisible one, the monk with the quill. He wasn't just copying. He was a gatekeeper. Every text that came into the scriptorium faced a judgment, a silent one. Was this knowledge worth saving? That answer was never simple. It came from the whole worldview of the monastery. These scribes were curators. They had a lens, a theological one, a cultural one. Their main mission was spiritual, not historical. So whether a text survived often came down to one thing. Could it be made useful to the faith? Works that seemed to line up with Christian doctrine, they got a privileged spot. Take Plato's dialogue, the Timaeus. It talks about a divine craftsman, a demiurge who brings order to the cosmos. To a medieval reader, that sounded a lot like the Genesis story. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. It was seen as a pagan glimpse of a Christian truth, so the Timaeus was copied for centuries, studied for centuries. It became a bridge, a way for medieval thinkers to engage with ancient philosophy without feeling they were leaving their faith. Practical knowledge had its own utility. Medical texts like Galen's, they were vital for the infirmary. Treatises on agriculture helped feed everyone, but maybe the most crucial practical science was astronomy. For calculating the calendar, the date of Easter, the most important feast, it depends on complex cycles, lunar cycles, solar cycles. Getting it wrong was unthinkable. So the work of ancient astronomers like Ptolemy, it wasn't just preserved, it was essential. It was infrastructure for the liturgical life of all of Europe. That knowledge had a direct purpose, an undeniable one, but then there were the texts that fell outside these filters, the purely pagan epics, celebrating gods and heroes in all their flawed human glory. The comedies of Aristophanes, full of satire and scandal. The historical works that presented a worldview without Christ. For these, the scriptorium door was usually closed. If a text seemed morally suspect, theologically dangerous, or just for entertainment, it was far less likely to be chosen for the labor of copying. No one necessarily set out to destroy them. They were just allowed to fade. The last copy in some regional library would crumble, and no new copy would be made to replace it. And with that, a voice from antiquity vanished. This was lost by neglect, a benign neglect, a quiet, passive editing of history. So the classical library that got rebuilt in the Middle Ages, it wasn't the original one. It was a curated collection, a version of antiquity that had already been interpreted, pruned, and framed by medieval Christian priorities. The gatekeepers saved a magnificent treasure. But they also, without any malice, they decided what parts of the past were worthy of a future. That shaped the foundations of Western thought for centuries. The conversation with the ancients would begin not with their full chorus of voices, but with a select choir, singing in a key the monks could recognize. The rescue mission had a physical cost. Every page was a sacrifice. The scrolls from the ancient world, they were made from papyrus, a reed plant pounded into sheets. It was cheap but fragile. It would crumble in the dry desert air or dissolve in the damp cellar of a monastery. To survive the new climate, knowledge needed a tougher skin. And it got one. Literally, the new standard became parchment, or its finer cousin, vellum. This wasn't paper from plants. This was a writing surface made from animal hide. Calves, sheep, goats, the skin was soaked, scraped, stretched, dried on a frame. The result was a smooth sheet, durable, almost luminous. It could last 1,000 years. But the price was immense. A single large Bible required the skins of hundreds of animals. Think of the flocks, the herds, the entire agricultural economy that had to exist just to supply one book. This wasn't just writing, it was alchemy, transforming a living creature into a permanent home for an idea. The medium itself became a statement. Knowledge written on vellum was declared by its substance to be worth a life. And then there was the new shape. The classical world wrote on scrolls. You unrolled a narrative, a poem. It was a linear journey. To find a passage, you had to scroll through. It was beautiful, but it was a performance. The medieval innovation was the Codex, sheets of parchment folded, bound along one edge, what we recognize as a book. This changed everything. Now you could flip to a specific page. You could compare two passages side by side. You could add an index, a table of contents. The Codex made text a tool for reference, for study, for argument. It turned reading from a sequential experience into a spatial one. You could jump around. You could cross-reference. This new format encouraged a new kind of thinking, a thinking that connected ideas across pages, that built complex systems. The architecture of the book began to shape the architecture of medieval philosophy. Then came the ink. It wasn't just black liquid, it was a crafted potion. The most common was iron gall ink, made from oak galls, those strange growths on oak trees formed by wasp larvae. They were crushed, mixed with iron salts from rusting metal. And gum arabic, a tree sap as a binder. The chemistry was precise, mixed correctly. It flowed beautifully from the quill and dried to a deep, permanent black. Mixed poorly, it could eat through the precious parchment over centuries. The scribe's toolkit was a surgeon's set, a quill knife for sharpening the goose feather into a perfect nib, a pumice stone to smooth the parchment surface, a ruler and a stylus to score invisible guidelines, a razor to scrape away a mistake. Every step was manual. Every material was local, from the landscape around the monastery, the oak tree, the goose, the sheep, the iron. The knowledge of the global ancient world was now being inscribed with the substances of a local medieval world. This is where the first quiet transformation happened, not in the words yet, but in their new body. Aristotle's logic was no longer a scroll in an Athenian library. It was a bound codex in a Frankish monastery, written on the skin of local sheep with ink from local oaks. Its physical presence was now medieval. Its cost was measured in flocks and harvests. Its use was enabled by the book's ability to be indexed and debated. The medium began to precondition the message. Before a single word was changed by a scribe's interpretation, the ideas of antiquity had already been translated into a new physical language, one of durability, of high cost, of structured reference. The classical mind was being rehoused, and the new architecture would change how that mind was understood. The parchment and ink were just the surface. There was a deeper change happening inside the scribe himself. He sat down with reverence. He wanted to be a conduit, a perfect copyist, but his hand was guided by a human brain, and the human brain interprets. It looks for patterns. It corrects what it thinks are mistakes. It fills in gaps. That's the paradox. In trying to save a text unchanged, the scribe became its quiet editor. Think about the process. For hours, his eyes moved from the old book to the new page. His quill followed, but fatigue is real. A distraction, a candle flicker, and his eye might jump. He might skip a line because the sentence ended on one line and started with the same word on the next. That error has a name: haplography, or his eye might catch and he'd write the same word twice: tautography. These were accidents of the body, a tired hand. But other changes came from the mind. The exemplar was often centuries old. The script was going out of style. Letters could be misread. A faded R might look like an N. An unfamiliar abbreviation, a shorthand from a monk 300 years earlier, might be guessed wrong. And then there was the scribe's own knowledge. If a sentence seemed awkward, he might smooth it out. If a reference to a pagan ritual was confusing, he might simplify it. If a philosophical statement seemed, at the very edge of his understanding, to touch a point of doctrine, he might adjust a word. Not from malice, from a desire for clarity, for correctness as he saw it. This was care, a wish to make the text right. Each of these moments, a skipped line, a repeated phrase, a corrected grammar, created a scribble variant. A tiny difference. No two manuscript copies were ever perfectly identical. They were like siblings, similar but distinct. Now multiply that single copy. It becomes the exemplar for a new scribe in another monastery. He introduces his own small variations. That copy travels, is copied again and again. Over decades, over centuries, across hundreds of copying events, these minute changes accumulate. They compound. The text begins to drift, slowly, like a continent shifting. A word changes here, a sentence is reordered there. A clarifying phrase written in a margin by one scribe gets copied into the main text by the next, who thought it was original. This was evolution by accident, a vast, collaborative, unplanned process of textual change. The scribe was never the author, but across generations, the community of scribes became a kind of slow-motion co-author. Curators and correctors, working without a plan, guided by instinct, habit, and the deep assumptions of their time. The classical idea entered the scriptorium in one form, and it left in its dozens of descendant copies in subtly different forms. The fingerprint was no longer just on the parchment, it was woven into the words. So then these slightly different versions of the same ancient truth began to circulate, and they began to collide, but the words themselves were changing. That was the deepest filter. For the monks in the scriptorium, the original language of so much ancient wisdom was a mystery. Greek had faded from the West. To them it was just these beautiful, impenetrable symbols. The works of Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, they were written in a code they couldn't read. So before a single word could be copied, it first had to cross a bridge. The translation bridge, and that crossing was perilous. A Greek scientific text might get translated into Syriac first by scholars in the Middle East. Centuries later, that Syriac version could be translated into Arabic during the golden age of Islamic scholarship. And finally, from Arabic, it would be translated into Latin by a monk in Spain or Sicily, sometimes working with a multilingual Jewish scholar. Each of these jumps was a transformation. Concepts that had no direct equivalent in the new language had to be approximated. A translator would search for the closest word. But the closest word always carries its own baggage. A Greek term for the soul, psyche, with its philosophical, almost scientific weight, might become the Latin anima, a word already rich with Christian theological meaning. The nuance shifted, the intellectual context was replaced, and even works originally written in Latin weren't safe. The Latin of Cicero wasn't the Latin of the monastery. Classical Latin was precise, structured, dense with references to a pagan world. It spoke of the Roman Senate, of the goddess Minerva, of civic virtues from a republic that had vanished. Medieval Latin was a living, working language, the language of the church, of administration, of theology. It was more flexible, often simpler. its vocabulary now infused with Christian terms. So when a scribe copied a text by Cicero, he wasn't just copying words, he was navigating a cultural gap. A complex, elegant sentence about Roman honor might feel unnecessarily convoluted. And instinctively, the scribe might simplify it, break it into two clearer sentences, and then what about that reference to the god Jupiter? To the scribe, Jupiter wasn't a living deity. He was a character from pagan myth, or worse, a demon. He might gloss the name, add a tiny note in the margin, false god of the ancients, or in a later copy, a well-meaning scribe might see that note and, thinking it part of the original text, incorporate it. Suddenly, Cicero's work contained a medieval theological commentary he never wrote. This was linguistic alchemy. The original metal of the thought was being purified or alloyed through the medium of a new language. The tone changed. The subtle shades of meaning, so dependent on the original cultural context, were flattened or recolored. A work of Greek natural philosophy, which saw the world as a system to be understood, could emerge in Latin dressed in the language of creation, pointing more toward a divine creator than toward the internal logic of nature itself. The bottleneck of translation and the evolution of Latin itself acted as a powerful, silent editor. It ensured the classical past could speak to the medieval present. But in making it speak clearly, it inevitably changed its voice. The ideas were preserved, but they began to speak in an accent the monks could not only understand but instinctively trust. The foreign was being made familiar, one carefully chosen word at a time. The most profound changes weren't mistakes, they were additions, deliberate ones. In the scriptorium, a scribe would be working with an ancient text. It was written for a different world, so he might add a note, a small clarification in the margin. That was the gloss. It started as a whisper, a personal aid, but it became a powerful engine of transformation. Think of a monk reading Plato. Plato describes the philosopher king. A ruler by wisdom. To the monk, that echoes a familiar figure, the bishop, the shepherd guiding his flock. So in the margin, he writes a note, as a bishop guides the church. It's a simple analogy, a bridge. He isn't changing Plato's words, he's framing them, giving a key. Then the next scribe comes to copy the book. He sees the gloss. It makes the passage clearer, more relevant, so he copies the gloss too, integrates it with the text. Over generations, the note is no longer a side comment. It becomes part of the work. Plato's voice now has a medieval interpreter beside it, guiding the understanding. This happened with Aristotle constantly. His physics describes natural motion, how objects move toward their natural place. A glossator might annotate that, add a reference to God as the unmoved mover. The ultimate source, the gloss doesn't contradict Aristotle, it baptizes him. It claims his pagan observation as a step toward Christian truth, or Virgil. A line about a heroic destiny might get a gloss linking it to the soul's journey toward salvation. Each gloss was a tiny act of translation, not of language but of meaning. It pulled the classical text into the medieval world. These marginal notes were copied, they accumulated. Some became so famous they were considered essential. The gloss became a standard companion. In many manuscripts, the original work sits in a narrow column in the center of the page, surrounded by a dense forest of commentary. From multiple scholars across centuries, to read the text was to read this composite. The original voice was never heard alone again. It was forever in dialogue. Filtered through its medieval guardians, this created a new kind of work, a palimpsest of thought. The gloss provided a running Christian interpretation. A constant frame, it let dangerous or puzzling ideas be studied safely. A passage that seemed to challenge doctrine could be countered right there by a marginal explanation. One that corrected it or contextualized it. The gloss made the foreign familiar. It made the pagan useful. It was the ultimate tool of integration. Through this quiet practice, the classical past wasn't just preserved. It was actively recruited into building a medieval Christian worldview. The ideas of Athens and Rome arrived in the future wearing new vestments. Explained and authorized by the very hands that saved them, the gloss was quiet, something written in the margin, but the illuminated page, that was loud. In the really expensive books, the text was surrounded by art, and it wasn't just decoration, it was an argument, a visual one. That's what illumination was. Gold leaf, blues from crushed lapis lazuli, reds from minerals. A decorated first letter could become a little stage. A full-page picture was a window into another world. This art wasn't an afterthought, it was a kind of commentary more powerful than any gloss. Think about a scribe copying an old astronomy text, Ptolemy's Almagest. It's about planetary motion. The text itself is neutral, mathematical, but the page it's on isn't neutral. The book opens with a big, illuminated letter P. Inside that gold swirl isn't a diagram of orbits. It's an image of God the Father, a compass in his hand, drawing the celestial spheres into being. The message is immediate. Before you read a single word of Ptolemy, the cosmos you're about to study isn't a machine, it's a creation. The ancient science is framed right from the start as a study of divine work. Or a philosophy book by Aristotle, a treatise on ethics. The borders of that page aren't filled with abstract vines, they're filled with tiny portraits of the Church Fathers. Augustine, Jerome, Gregory, these theologians stand there like silent witnesses, a visual choir around the pagan philosopher's words. Their presence says something. It says any wisdom here has already been approved, contained within Christian thought. The art creates a context the text alone never could. Even a simple decorated letter could do this. A capital I at the start of a history might be formed from the body of a serpent, crushed under the foot of a saint. The reader's eye learns the hierarchy before the mind reads the sentence. Good wins, order is imposed. The chaotic stories of the past are presented inside a frame of moral certainty. This visual guidance was crucial for texts that were complex, or abstract, or potentially dangerous. A difficult passage on natural philosophy could be anchored by a familiar biblical scene in the margin, tethering the new idea to a sacred story. The beauty of the page, the expense of the gold and pigment, had a dual purpose. It glorified God, but it also commanded authority. It said this knowledge is valuable. But its value is defined by this holy container we've built for it. The illuminated manuscript didn't just preserve classical knowledge, it staged it. It set the lighting, built the scenery, it put the actors in a new play. The ancient wisdom became a performer in a grander medieval drama. The reader was never allowed to encounter the raw text alone. They were always guided by the gilded frame, instructed by the surrounding imagery, reminded that every idea, no matter where it came from, now existed to illuminate a single, overarching truth. The art made the foreign familiar and subservient. It translated abstract concepts into a visual language of faith, so even the eyes took part in transforming the past. The most radical editing wasn't in the margins, it was in the book's structure. Monks almost never copied a whole, massive work straight through. That took too much time, too much parchment. They did something else, a kind of intellectual surgery. They made anthologies called florilegia, flower collections. A monk, a compiler with a specific need, would go through many different books. He'd pick out choice passages, like picking the best blooms from a huge, wild garden. He'd collect every statement from Augustine on grace, every relevant line from Aristotle on ethics, every poetic fragment from Virgil that hinted at some higher longing. Then he'd arrange these picked flowers into a new bouquet, organized by theme, a chapter on the virtues, another on the vices, a section on the soul. The result was a single, convenient volume, a greatest hits album of wisdom made for a purpose. It was efficient, practical, but the effect was revolutionary. It lifted ideas right out of their original context. A passionate line from the Roman poet Ovid, written about romantic love, could end up in a Floralgium chapter on Christian charity. Surrounded by quotes from St. Paul, suddenly Ovid's words weren't about earthly desire anymore. They were read as a poetic reflection on divine love. The original meaning was erased. A new meaning was written by the company the quote now kept. The same thing happened with philosophy. A complex, nuanced argument from Aristotle's Politics about citizenship could be cut down to one pithy sentence in a chapter on good rule. Isolated from its supporting logic, from its talk of Athenian democracy, that sentence became a free-floating maxim. It could be used to support medieval kingship or a bishop's authority. The compiler, by his selection and arrangement, became a new kind of author. He didn't write the words, he wrote the relationships between them. This created a patchwork philosophy, a mosaic built from classical and Christian rubble. These Florilegia were the textbooks of the medieval world. A student learning about justice wouldn't read all of Plato's Republic. He'd read a compiled page of quotes from Plato, from Cicero, from the Book of Proverbs, from St. Augustine, all speaking to the same idea. In this new, synthetic form, the different voices started to harmonize. They sounded like they were all part of one long, continuous conversation, a conversation that always seemed to be heading toward a Christian conclusion. The original works, in their full, sprawling complexity, were like grand, crumbling cathedrals. The Floralgium was a chapel built from their best stones. It was smaller, more focused. It served the immediate needs of the community. But to build that chapel, the original architecture had to be taken apart. The classical past wasn't just preserved in these anthologies, it was quarried. Its most useful parts were extracted and then reassembled into a new structure that the medieval world could not only understand but live inside. The compiler, with his scissors and paste, was maybe the most powerful transformer of all. He didn't change the words on the page, he changed the universe in which those words were read. The most powerful filter was invisible. It was the lens through which every text was viewed. The scriptorium's ultimate purpose wasn't historical preservation for its own sake. It was salvation. Every activity was directed toward one goal: the spiritual edification of the community, the strengthening of the faith. This hidden agenda meant every classical text, no matter how secular, was assessed for a single question. Could it build up the soul? Could it be mined for spiritual insight? This lens, seeing all knowledge as pointing toward a divine purpose, redirected everything that was saved. Take history. When a monk copied the Roman historian Livy, he wasn't doing it for a neutral record. He was looking for examples of virtue to emulate, or vice to avoid. The rise and fall of empires in those pages became a moral drama, a lesson in pride and humility, justice and corruption, played out on a historical stage. The past wasn't a foreign country, it was a sermon, a long, intricate sermon about the consequences of human action, meant to instruct the present. Medicine was seen the same way. Galen's descriptions of the body, the four humors, were studied intently, but the goal was never just physical healing, it was wonder. The body was a masterpiece of divine craftsmanship. To study its veins, its organs, was to study the mind of the Creator. Illness was a disruption of a sacred order. Healing was restoring a divine design. So a medical text was, in its own way, a theological text, a guide to understanding God's intricate artwork. This lens changed how knowledge was applied. Ancient science, which sought explanations within nature, became the study of God's handiwork. The motion of the planets wasn't just physics, it was celestial liturgy. The growth of a plant wasn't just biology, it was a parable about spiritual growth. Every natural fact became a signpost pointing toward a higher truth. Even rhetoric, the art of persuasion taught by Cicero, was repurposed. Its complex rules for argument, for moving an audience, weren't saved so monks could debate politics. They were honed to become tools for preaching. The power of a well-turned phrase, a compelling analogy, was a power to save souls. Classical eloquence was baptized, put in service of the gospel, so the classical library that emerged was already interpreted. It was a collection of tools and lessons, all bent toward a single, overarching purpose. The original intentions of Aristotle or Ptolemy weren't discarded, but they were enveloped. Their quest for knowledge was seen as a partial groping toward the full light the monastery now held. This wasn't a distortion in the cynical sense. It was an act of integration. The pagan past was given a job in the Christian present. Its knowledge was put to work in the only workshop that mattered. The workshop of salvation, the scribe, the glossator, the compiler, they were all laborers in that workshop, and every text they handled was raw material, to be shaped and polished and fitted into the great architecture of faith. Aristotle's journey through the scriptorium, that's the map of the change. His logical works, the organon, they weren't just saved, they became essential. It was practical. Aristotle gave the medieval world something it needed. A toolkit for clear thinking, his system of syllogisms, his categories, a structured way to build an argument from the ground up, premise, conclusion. A powerful engine for organizing thought, and in a world dedicated to divine truth, that engine was put to work. Theology was the queen of the sciences. She needed a rigorous method. Aristotle's logic became that method, the perfect tool for parsing biblical passages, for debating doctrine, for building vast systems of belief that could withstand challenge. So the organon was copied, studied, commented on with an intensity few other texts received, preserved not as a curiosity, but as a vital instrument. But a shift occurred. Aristotle developed his logic as part of a larger project, a project of understanding the natural world. His categories were meant to classify everything. Rocks, animals, the motions of the stars. Logic was the scaffolding for natural philosophy, for science. In the scriptorium, that original context was left behind. The scaffolding was kept, but the building it supported was changed. The natural world was no longer the primary object. Divine revelation was. So Aristotle's logical tools were extracted from their Greek setting. Polished, refined, handed to the scholastic thinkers, men like Thomas Aquinas. In Aquinas's hands, the syllogism did not investigate nature, it defended dogma. It systematized faith. His monumental work, the Summa Theologica, a cathedral of thought built with Aristotelian bricks. He uses Aristotle's definitions, his categories, his method of argument, to explore questions of Christian theology, the existence of God, the nature of the soul, the workings of grace. The method was preserved with fidelity. But the ultimate goal was redirected. Aristotle's engine for discovering how the world is became the medieval church's engine for explaining what it must believe. This wasn't a betrayal, it was adoption, the highest form of flattery. The medieval mind saw in Aristotle's logic a universal grammar of reason, a grammar they believed could be applied to any subject, even the highest mysteries. By preserving and repurposing his work, they ensured its survival, gave it a central role for centuries, but they performed a quiet surgery. They separated the logical method from the empirical, world-focused spirit that originally animated it. The tool survived in brilliant working order, yet the hand that now wielded it and the material it was now cutting were completely new. Aristotle provided the rules of the game. The scholastics simply decided with reverence that they were playing a different game entirely. Ptolemy's star charts were precise. The medieval world couldn't ignore that. His great work, the Almagest, mapped the planets. It used circles upon circles, epicycles moving on larger deference, to predict where Mars or Jupiter would be. For the Church, this wasn't just academic, it was infrastructure. Calculating Easter required the spring equinox. Tracking the lunar cycle was essential. Ptolemy's model was the most reliable celestial clock ever made, so his work was copied, studied, preserved with immense care. The data, the numbers, the geometric proofs, they were transmitted with remarkable fidelity. But the meaning of those numbers was quietly rewritten. Ptolemy's cosmos was a brilliant machine, a geometric model of sublime complexity, centered on a stationary Earth. For him, this was likely a mathematical convenience, a tool for prediction. The spheres might have been abstract, not necessarily physical shells, but the medieval mind lived in a universe thick with meaning. They received Ptolemy's mathematics and gave it a home inside a vast spiritual architecture. Those concentric spheres weren't just diagrams, they became real crystalline layers. Each one a distinct level of creation, and each level had a purpose, a resident, a place in the divine order. The moon's sphere was closest, changeable, and imperfect. Then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, each planet occupied its own shell. Beyond them lay the sphere of the fixed stars, a glittering tapestry. But medieval cosmology didn't stop where Ptolemy's math did. They added layers, the primum mobile, the first mover, the invisible sphere that communicated motion from the divine realm down through the cosmos, and finally, beyond all motion, the empyrean heaven. The abode of God and the angels and the blessed, pure light and peace. In this scheme, Ptolemy's epicycles and deference weren't just calculating tools. They became the physical gears of a divine clockwork. The planets moved in their complex dances not by blind law, but as part of a celestial liturgy. Their music was the harmony of the spheres, a literal song of praise. The sphere of Saturn, slow and solemn, might be governed by an order of contemplative angels. The sphere of Mars, with its reddish hue, by angels of righteous strength. So when a monk studied the Almagest, he was learning two things at once: the precise mathematics to track a planet's path, and the spiritual geography of creation. The book's technical diagrams would often be framed by illuminations of angels or of Christ presiding over the entire system. The science was preserved, but it was enveloped. It became the how of a universe whose why was already fully known. Ptolemy gave them the blueprint for the clock. They already knew the clockmaker, and they understood the clock's purpose was to glorify him. This transformation ensured the Almagest's survival. By embedding its hard science within a resonant spiritual narrative, medieval scholars made it indispensable. They didn't reject its accuracy, they claimed its accuracy as proof of a deeper truth. The perfect mathematical order of the heavens was, to them, the clearest possible signature of a divine intellect. So Ptolemy's ancient stars were saved, but they now shone down on a universe that was, in every sense, a cathedral. That grand cathedral of thought, it wasn't built just from Latin. The scriptoriums were one chapter. The story of survival is much longer. For centuries, the main light of Greek wisdom, it wasn't burning in Europe's damp stone halls. It was shining somewhere else, in the great libraries of Baghdad, in Cordoba. It was kept alive by scholars writing in Arabic and Hebrew. They didn't see the ancient Greeks as a pagan threat. They saw an intellectual inheritance, something to study, to debate, to build on. Aristotle's survival, especially, owes a huge debt to this Eastern journey. In the West, many Latin copies of his works on natural philosophy were lost, or just neglected, but the Islamic world embraced them with a scholar's passion. In centers like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, teams of translators worked. They rendered Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, from Greek and Syriac into Arabic. This wasn't just copying, it was fusion, intellectual fusion. Thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, they didn't just preserve Aristotle's texts, they wrote vast commentaries. They wrestled with his ideas. They asked how his logic, his metaphysics, could coexist with the Quran. They synthesized his thought with Neoplatonic philosophy, creating new systems, rich systems. A century later, the Persian polymath Avicenna produced an encyclopedia, Philosophy and Medicine. It integrated Aristotle so thoroughly it became the standard text. Across the whole Islamic world, in that environment, Aristotle wasn't a relic, he was a living conversation partner. His works were challenged, expanded, reinterpreted through an Islamic lens. The same process happened in Jewish scholarship, especially in Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Spain. Moses Maimonides, writing in Arabic, engaged with this tradition. This Islamic Aristotelian tradition, in his Guide for the Perplexed, he tried to reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with Jewish scripture, with Jewish law, creating a rational foundation for faith, one that acknowledged Greek reason. So when this knowledge began flowing back into Western Europe in the 12th century, it was changed. Profoundly changed. Christian scholars in translation hubs like Toledo, they started working, often with Jewish intermediaries, translating these Arabic versions of Aristotle into Latin. What they received wasn't the pure, original Greek Aristotle. It was Aristotle as understood by Avicenna. It was Ptolemy with the commentaries of Islamic astronomers. It was a classical heritage but pre-packaged with 1,000 years of interpretation, sophisticated interpretation from another faith tradition. This was a second wave. A massive wave of transformation. European monks, hungry for this lost knowledge, suddenly had access to an Aristotle who spoke about metaphysics, about the nature of God, with a complexity they'd never encountered. These Arabic commentaries introduced concepts, arguments that would shape medieval scholasticism, fundamentally shape it. The Aristotle that Thomas Aquinas later Christianized in many ways was an Aristotle who had already been Islamicized. The journey through Baghdad and Cordoba added another filter, another set of fingerprints on the parchment. It proved that preservation is never passive. Whether in a Christian scriptorium or an Islamic madrasa, to save an idea is to enter a dialogue with it. And every dialogue changes both participants. It changes them forever. The ancient world's map of knowledge was different. It was all connected. Practical skill and theoretical wisdom weren't separated. A Roman engineer like Vitruvius wrote about architecture, but his work was full of geometry, astronomy, philosophy. The how and the why were woven together. When that knowledge reached the medieval scriptorium, it got sorted, reclassified. The new map was the 7 liberal arts, and it wasn't just a list. It was a hierarchy, a ladder for the mind. The first 3 were the trivium. They were about language, grammar to get the words right, rhetoric to use them powerfully, logic to think clearly. These were the tools for handling any text. The next 4 were the quadrivium. They were about number, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. They were seen as the mathematical keys to understanding an ordered universe. This system, the liberal arts, defined proper education for a free person. For a cleric or a scholar, everything else was pushed to the margins, and what was pushed to the margins, the arts mechanici, the mechanical arts, that was the realm of practical, hands-on knowledge. Architecture, metalworking, weaving, agriculture, navigation, medicine. In the ancient world, these were part of a unified pursuit. In the medieval reclassification, they became something else. They were necessary, of course. The world needed builders and healers, but this knowledge was seen as lower, servile. It dealt with the material, the changeable, the earthly. It was the work of the hands, not the contemplation of the soul. So when a classical text on engineering or medicine was copied, it was often copied for its utility, not for its place in the higher curriculum. It was a manual, not a masterpiece of liberal learning. This reclassification changed how texts were studied, and therefore what they were thought to mean. Take that same Roman manual on architecture. In its original context, it was a practical guide for building aqueducts and temples. In the medieval world, a scholar studying the quadrivium might extract just the geometric principles from it, the perfect ratios for a column, the symmetry of a floor plan. These weren't studied to build a better church necessarily. They were studied as earthly reflections of divine harmony. The numbers that made a building beautiful were the same numbers that ordered the music of the spheres. The practical manual was mined for abstract spiritual insight. Its original purpose was left behind. The same thing happened with medical texts. Galen's detailed anatomy was vital for the monastery's infirmary. But within the liberal arts framework, the body itself became a text to be read symbolically. The four humors mirrored the four elements of the cosmos. The balance of health echoed the balance of the soul. The practical knowledge was preserved, but its significance was elevated, translated into the language of the quadrivium. It became another piece of evidence for a universe structured by number and proportion. This act of sorting was a powerful, quiet transformation. It didn't destroy practical knowledge, but it fundamentally changed its status, its perceived purpose. The classical inheritance was broken apart. Its pieces were assigned new roles in a new intellectual drama. The theoretical was lifted up, polished, and integrated into the grand project of understanding God's rational order. The practical was maintained, but often stripped of its philosophical context. It became a set of techniques waiting to be infused with meaning from the higher arts. The medieval mind, by drawing this new map, decided what parts of the past were worthy of the highest contemplation. And in doing so, it set the course for what would be considered true knowledge for centuries to come. The library was not only copied and glossed, it was catalogued. And every catalog tells you what its maker values most. That silent editing, that filtering, it wasn't all accidental. Sometimes it was a choice, a conscious one. You'd have a scribe or the abbot in charge, and they'd come across a line, and it wasn't just old, it felt wrong, a passage that went against scripture, a story that praised a pagan god too strongly, a claim that said the soul wasn't eternal. In those moments, the scribe stopped being just a copyist. He became a guardian. And a guardian protects. Sometimes that means removing what you see as a threat. This wasn't some organized book burning. It was 1,000 separate decisions. Made in quiet rooms, a monk, completely believing in his sacred job to pass on truth, would face a conflict, his duty to copy exactly, and his duty to protect people from error. And often the protection won. The fix could be simple: just leave it out, omission. He might skip the bad lines, leave a gap in the text that some later scholar would find and wonder about, never knowing a choice was made there. Or he might rewrite it. A ritual for Zeus becomes just an ancient ceremony. A passionate poem from Rome gets its edges smoothed, its physical desire muted into something more like a metaphor. Sometimes the correction was direct. You'd get a philosophical argument for a materialist view, the world as just atoms and empty space, and right there in the margin a firm reply. This is false, a note would say. As Augustine teaches, the spiritual comes first, and that note in the margin, as we know, could get copied into the main text by the next scribe. So the original argument would now be permanently wrapped in its own rebuttal. A reader would never meet the idea alone. It would always come with the answer already attached. This whole process was a purification, a kind of theological cleaning. The goal wasn't to destroy the past, but to sanitize it, to make it safe. The line between preserving a text and saving the reader from that text got very thin. A scribe might think he was saving the valuable heart of an old work by cutting away the rotten bits. He was saving the baby, but he was also the one deciding what was the bathwater. Take Ovid, the Roman poet full of transformations and love affairs. His work was popular but dangerous, so a monk putting together a collection of poetic highlights might only pick the lines about change that could point to spiritual change. The more risque stories would be left out completely. The Ovid that survived in many monastery libraries was a tamed Ovid, an Ovid already halfway interpreted for a Christian audience. This censorship was powerful because it was decentralized, personal. It came from conscience, not a royal order. Each scribe used his own understanding of right belief, his own sense of moral danger. The result was a slow, uneven but constant pressure, a pressure that gently shaped the classical inheritance, bent it to fit more comfortably inside the walls of the faith. The intention was protection, but the effect was another deep transformation. The past wasn't just being saved from being forgotten, it was being saved from itself. The scribe's work was quiet, but it was supported by economics. If you think of a scriptorium as just a spiritual retreat, you're missing something. It was a workshop. A specialized one and very costly. Making a book drained resources at every stage. That illuminated Bible we talked about, it wasn't only a spiritual achievement. It was a capital project. The parchment alone cost a small fortune in livestock. Then the colors. That deep blue came from lapis lazuli, mined in one remote part of Afghanistan. It traveled thousands of miles along trade routes, becoming more precious than gold by weight. The gold leaf itself, beaten incredibly thin, was wealth pressed right onto the page. And the labor, the years of a scribe's life, an illuminator's skill, that was time and talent not spent farming or building or doing other work. The whole monastic community supported this. They tilled the fields, cooked the meals, maintained the walls, all to free those few hands for the delicate work of copying. That made the finished book one of the most valuable objects in the medieval world. It was a store of wealth as solid as a chest of coins. Often, it was a chest of coins. These books were usually commissions. A wealthy noble family, seeking God's favor, would pay for a lavish psalter for their local church. A king, wanting to show piety and power, would commission a giant Bible for his royal chapel. A bishop, rising in the church, needed a splendid gospel book to cement his authority. The patron's taste and purpose shaped what the scriptorium produced. This economic reality created a filter, operating alongside the theological one. What got copied wasn't just what was spiritually useful, it was what was financially viable. A beautifully illuminated book of hours for private prayer was in high demand among the aristocracy. Liturgical books, missals, breviaries were needed in every cathedral and monastery. These were safe investments. They guaranteed the scriptorium's work would be finished, its costs covered, its community supported. But then there's that dense, obscure philosophical treatise by some unknown Greek commentator. It might fascinate a handful of scholars, but no wealthy patron was lining up to pay for its lavish reproduction. Its survival often hinged on a different economy, the economy of personal scholarly interest. A lone abbot with a passion for logic might quietly task a scribe to copy it onto leftover parchment in a plain style without gold or lapis. These working copies survived, but they were the exception, so the market silently curated the canon. The texts copied most often, in the most expensive editions, were the ones that reinforced the visual and liturgical splendor of the faith. They were also the ones most likely to survive the centuries in robust, beautiful condition. A humble, text-only manuscript was more vulnerable to decay, more likely to be discarded when worn. The glorious illuminated volume, treated as a treasure, was protected, stored in a chest, passed down as an heirloom. The medieval library that comes down to us isn't a perfect mirror of what was studied. It's a mirror reflecting what was funded. The economic engine of the scriptorium, for all its spiritual purpose, ensured the past was preserved in a form that glittered, literally, and in the eyes of its powerful patrons. The market for beauty quietly decided which voices from antiquity would get the most durable and most beautiful vessels for their journey into the future. Before the great standardization, you had a chaotic reality. economic pressures didn't guarantee the text you copied was correct. A scriptorium in Ireland might have one version of a work. A monastery in Italy had another, filled with generations of scribal errors. Then, in the 8th and 9th centuries, a political force stepped in. Emperor Charlemagne ruled over a vast part of Western Europe. He launched a cultural revival. His goal was to unify his empire through faith and learning, and he saw the bewildering variety of handwriting, the corrupted copies of key texts, as a direct threat to that unity. How could you have a unified church if every monastery was reading a slightly different version of the Psalms or the Church Fathers? His solution was radical in its simplicity. He promoted a new way of writing, the Carolingian minuscule. This wasn't just a new font, it was a revolution in clarity. Before this, scripts were dense. They were regional, letters ran together, abbreviations were cryptic and local. Carolingian minuscule introduced clean, rounded, separated letters. It used consistent punctuation. Clear word spacing. For the first time in centuries, a monk in Bavaria could read a text from France without struggling to decipher the script itself. Charlemagne's court scholars pushed this reform. Thinkers like Alcuin of York, they sent out model books written in the new script. They established a standard. Scriptoria across the empire adopted it. They became hubs for producing these new, clean copies. The goal was fidelity, to go back to the oldest, best sources they could find. To produce a correct version, free from the scribbled drift of centuries, and in many ways it worked. It saved countless texts from further corruption. It made learning more accessible. This wave of standardization created the foundational copies. Most later medieval manuscripts would descend from these. But here's the profound twist. Even standardization is a form of transformation. By choosing to fix a text in this new, elegant script, they were also freezing it. Freezing it in a particular moment of understanding. The scholars at Charlemagne's court had to choose which old manuscript to use as their exemplar. That choice was an interpretation. The version they deemed correct might already contain centuries of glosses and edits. Now those were baked permanently into the authoritative text. A marginal note from a father like Augustine, originally just a comment, could be copied into the main body of the new, official Carolingian edition. From that point forward, it wasn't a gloss anymore. It was scripture, and the act of standardizing content meant making selections. Which works were essential for the revival, which were not. The Carolingian program had a curriculum. It focused on the Latin Church Fathers, on liturgy, on a core set of classical texts useful for education. Works that fell outside this approved canon, even if they'd been circulating in some remote scriptorium, were now less likely to be recopied. Less likely to be written in the beautiful new minuscule. They were sidelined by the very process meant to save everything, so the Carolingian reform didn't just preserve the past. It curated a specific version of it, it codified it, it created a kind of official library for Western Christendom. The messy, living tradition of textual variation was tamed. It was organized, and in being organized, it was subtly rewritten. The antique ancestor, in all its raw and varied forms, receded further into the distance. What remained was its polished, authorized portrait, drawn in the clear, confident lines of a new imperial hand. Charlemagne's clear letters built an official library. But no library is ever really sealed. The tools of preservation, the logic, the grammar, the texts they recovered, they became a kind of seed bank. And centuries later, a different kind of mind would come looking for a different harvest. The medieval project to Christianize classical knowledge had this unintended result. It saved everything a later age would need to question the medieval world itself. By copying Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, the Roman poets, the scriptoriums didn't bury the past, they stockpiled it. They built the archive that Renaissance humanists would one day storm. These new scholars in the 14th and 15th centuries, they had a radically different goal. They weren't after spiritual lessons or theological tools. They were obsessed with recovering the pure, original voice of antiquity. They wanted to hear Cicero speak as a Roman statesman, not as some proto-Christian moralist. They wanted Aristotle's biology as natural philosophy, not as allegory for divine creation. To do that, they needed the very manuscripts the monks had made. But they read them with new eyes. A humanist scholar would travel, library to library, monastery to monastery. He'd collect multiple copies of the same classical work. Each one a different medieval version, filled with glosses, corrections, scribble variants. His method was comparative. He'd lay them side by side, line by line. He'd look for the places where the texts disagreed, where a marginal note in one manuscript had become part of the main text in another, where a difficult pagan reference had been smoothed over or explained away. By comparing these different branches of the textual tree, the humanist acted like a literary detective, trying to deduce the original by spotting the later additions. He sought to strip away the medieval layers of interpretation, like an art restorer cleaning centuries of varnish from a painting, hoping to find the original colors underneath. In that work, the very transformations made by the scriptorium became the clues, the gloss that identified Plato's demiurge with the Christian god that now stood out as a later insertion. The allegorical reading of a Virgil poem was seen as a medieval imposition. The humanists, using the philological tools that medieval scholarship had refined, they turned those tools back on the medieval tradition. They argued that to truly honor the ancients, you had to encounter them on their own terms, not through 1,000 years of commentary. That was a profound reversal. The monastery's vault had kept the treasure safe, but now a new generation had found the key, and they understood the treasure in a completely different way. They saw the medieval framing not as a protective case, but as a cage. So the scriptorium's greatest success preserving the textual corpus of antiquity through centuries of turmoil, it became the foundation for its own critique. The preserved library became the arsenal for a revolution in thought. The humanists used those meticulously copied manuscripts to reconstruct a vision of the ancient world. A vision that was civic, human-centered, often secular in outlook. A vision that would help ignite the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution. It's a deep historical irony. The monastic scribe, trying to make the pagan past serve the Christian present, he accidentally preserved it intact enough for a future age to rediscover its independent power. He saved the seed, and he couldn't control what soil a later gardener would choose or what kind of tree would grow. Preservation, even when it transforms, it never has a single, fixed outcome. It's an act of faith in the future with consequences that always escape the preserver's intent. The scribe lived in isolation. His world was a slanted desk, a pot of ink, the scratch of a quill. Hours into days, days into years, no music, no conversation, just the rhythm of his own hand. It was a psychological state, a mind shaped by silence and repetition. To copy a text perfectly required a trance, the eye tracking each letter, the hand forming its mirror, the mind holding the meaning just enough to catch a skipped line. It was meditation, a single-pointed concentration that blotted out the world, and in that state the text wasn't just words, it could become a living presence. The scribe might feel he was talking to a long-dead author, or that he was performing a sacred act, inscribing divine wisdom into being. That devotion turned monotony into purpose. The aching back, the stiff fingers, they became a form of prayer, a sacrifice offered through the body, but the mind can't sustain pure focus, it wanders. It rebels, and the manuscripts show this. In the margins of holy books, the scribe breaks through, a doodle of a strange beast in the corner, a face peering from the loop of an O. Sometimes he speaks directly, a tiny note of complaint, The parchment is hairy and difficult. Oh, my hand. Thank God it will soon be dark. One scribe finishes a hard section and writes, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." These aren't errors, they're cracks in the discipline, moments where the individual, with his fatigue and humor, bleeds through. This ebb and flow shape the texts we have. A moment of drifting attention, a glance away, and the eye could jump. He might repeat a line or skip one. Misread a faint word. These were accidents of a tired mind, but other changes came from clarity or whimsy. A beautiful capital letter gets an extra flourish. A vine of decoration spills beyond its bounds. A standard abbreviation written out in full, just for the pleasure of the complete word. In one manuscript, a scribe bored with a long list of names suddenly writes a line of rhythmic nonsense. A verbal doodle to break the tedium, so every manuscript is a layered record. The original author's thought, the accumulated edits of tradition, and the psychological fingerprint of its final copyist. His devotion is in the steady, even lines. His humanity is in the marginal sigh, the playful sketch, the unique mistake that appears nowhere else. To read a medieval manuscript is to eavesdrop on a long, quiet conversation between the past and the future, but also a conversation a person had with himself, in a silent room under the weight of a sacred duty, with nothing but his own wandering mind for company. The psychology of the copyist is the final layer of ink on every page. It reminds us that knowledge never travels in the abstract. It's always carried in the hands and the mind of a specific, tired, devoted, wonderfully human being. Truth changed where it lived. For the classical thinkers, an idea's real home was in the air. It was spoken, debated in the Athenian agora, argued in the Roman forum. Truth was something you performed. You proved it through the clash of rhetoric and logic in front of a live audience. A written text was just a reminder. A script for the real event, which was always a conversation. Then you walk into the medieval scriptorium, and you're in a different universe of thought. The dominant sound is silence. The primary activity isn't speaking, it's seeing, reading. The monks practiced lectio divina, divine reading, a slow, contemplative absorption of a fixed text. That was a revolution in how knowledge was understood. By copying classical works into codices, the scriptoria didn't just save old ideas, they moved the seat of authority. They relocated truth from the vibrating air of the public square to the silent, permanent ink on a parchment page. This shift from oral to written culture is profound. In an oral world, knowledge is fluid. It adapts to the audience, to the moment. Each telling is a new performance, a slight variation. The authority rests in the speaker, in their skill, in their memory, but in a written culture, the authority transfers to the document itself. The text becomes the object, it is fixed, it can be pointed to. Quoted, analyzed letter by letter, the scriptorium, by making the book the central artifact, made the text the final witness. What was written down was what was true. This new reverence elevated the book to an almost sacred object. It was venerated, kissed, carried in procession, a relic of wisdom, but that veneration came with a cost. Fixing an idea in writing also freezes it. In the forum, an argument could be challenged on the spot, refined, abandoned on the page. The argument is locked in place. It says the same thing tomorrow that it said a century ago. That immobility made classical ideas, once copied into the monastic book, strangely vulnerable. They were captured, and a captured idea is an idea you can meticulously study, dissect, and most importantly, frame. The frozen text became the perfect subject for the gloss and the commentary. Because the words themselves couldn't answer back, couldn't adapt, scholars could surround them. They could build entire architectures of interpretation upon a single, static sentence. The vibrant, living dialogue of the Athenian Academy became a silent, one-way conversation. where the ancient author spoke a line and centuries of medieval commentators spoke back, filling the margins with their own understanding. So the scriptorium's quiet work did more than rescue knowledge. It changed the fundamental rules. It helped create a world where truth was something you looked up, not something you worked out in conversation. It made the book the ultimate authority, and in doing that, it set the stage for everything that followed, for the scholastic summary, for the theological debates, for the very idea that you could settle an argument by citing a chapter and verse. The classical mind was saved from oblivion, but it was saved into a new kind of prison. A glorious, gilded, and deeply silent prison, built of parchment and ink. For a long time, the centers of learning were all in the south: Alexandria, Rome, Constantinople. That's where the old texts were, but then things changed. The work of keeping those texts didn't stop, it just moved. The new places weren't marble buildings in the sun. They were stone huts on islands, timber halls in northern forests. The scriptorium itself traveled. It went in the bags of missionaries, in the chests of scholars. And the whole center of classical knowledge moved with it, north and west, far from where it started. This was more than a move, it was a transplant. Into a completely different world. Think of Iona, a small island off Scotland, always wet with rain. Irish monks set up a scriptorium there. They were copying the same Latin texts that people once read in Rome. But their Rome wasn't a real place, it was a memory. A story about a fallen empire with roads and aqueducts they'd never seen. Their world was about clans. A rough landscape, a Christianity mixed with older local ways. So when a scribe on Iona copied Virgil, describing the Italian countryside, he was copying about a place as mythical as Atlantis. The words were saved, but the world behind those words was foreign. Or there's Wearmouth and Jarrow in northern England. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Bede worked there. He wrote his history, his science. He had a great library, books brought from Italy and Gall. He used that classical knowledge to calculate Easter, to write his history. But his frame of reference was Northumbria. The old Roman walls nearby were just ruins, not working defenses. The political ideas from Cicero were abstractions. His reality was the warrior kings of the Anglo-Saxons. So when Bede read Roman texts on government, he wasn't trying to bring back the Senate. He was using those ideas to advise the Christian kings of his own time. Interpreting classical virtue through a northern monastic mind. Then the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne, his palace school at Aachen, abbeys like Tours. They became the new centers for copying. This was a project to revive Roman glory, but a Christian version. Scholars like Alcuin worked with texts that had already traveled from Italy, through Britain or Spain, into the heart of Europe. The context changed again. These were communities building a new Christian empire from nothing. For them, the classical past was a source to mine for administrative models. Legal principles, art styles to be baptized. In every one of these new homes, the ancient material was read through a local lens. A Greek philosophical term might be understood through the image of a northern forest. A Roman legal idea might be mapped onto Frankish tribal custom. The climate shaped the metaphors. The local politics shaped how things were used. The very language of thought was inflected by the rhythms of a northern agricultural year. Not the Mediterranean cycle of olive harvests and sea trade. This geographical shift was a final, deep layer of change. The ideas from Athens and Rome were born in a world of city-states and public debate and sunny rationalism. They took root in a world of monasteries and feudal bonds and a deeply interior penitential faith. They weren't preserved by the heirs of their creators, but by their cultural grandchildren living in a different mental and physical landscape. The books survived the journey, but the world they were understood in had changed completely. Unrecognizable to their original authors, the map of knowledge was redrawn, and every idea now lived in a new country. The quiet in the scriptorium was a kind of choice. It kept some voices alive, but so many others just faded out. The classical world was much louder than what ended up in the library. Take the plays from Athens. We have the serious ones from Aeschylus and Sophocles. They're about fate, divine justice, things that made sense to a monastic mind. But the comedies, the ones by Aristophanes, are full of political jokes, body humor, making fun of the gods. Most of those are gone, only a few made it through. That kind of loud, disrespectful laughter didn't fit the mold. It seemed frivolous, or worse, it seemed dangerous. So that whole side of things, that sharp, democratic wit, it got erased. Same thing happened to a lot of the poetry, the lyric poetry like Sappho's. Personal, sensual, about individual passion and beauty, that stood against the communal, spiritual life of the cloister. Her work survived in pieces, just fragments quoted by other writers. And the early science, the early philosophy, the ideas that challenged what came later, they often vanished. We only have the winning side of the argument. We know about Democritus, who talked about atoms and void, mainly because Aristotle argued against him. Democritus's own books are lost. Then there were the personal things. Memoirs, letters, the records of daily life. They rarely seemed worth the work of copying. They weren't seen as material for building theology or moral lessons. And that creates a distortion, a deep one. Our whole view of antiquity is framed by what these medieval monks thought was important. We're looking through a lens made for spiritual teaching. The classical world was vibrant, messy, gloriously secular. Its laughter, its personal passions, its scientific dead ends, its radical heresies, all that was narrowed down. What survived became, by default, the only representative of something much richer. We have the solemn symphony, but we lost the jazz. We have the formal portrait, but not the candid snapshot. The paradox is that the act of saving so much also decided what was worth remembering. To understand what the scriptorium gave us, you have to see the ghostly shape of everything it let go. Everything it let fall silent. The scriptorium wasn't a place where ideas were equal. The scribe held the pen, but the hand was guided by someone else. The patron, an abbot, a bishop, a king, they had the vision and they had the money. Every manuscript started as a commission, a specific order for a specific purpose. The patron didn't just pay for materials, he dictated the whole project, its scope, its style, whether it existed at all. He was the silent partner in every line. Take a bishop in the 11th century. His diocese is growing. He needs to standardize practice to assert his authority over local priests. So what does he order from the scriptorium? Not poetry, not astronomy. He orders canon law, collections of papal decrees, council rulings. These texts become his administrative tools. They define orthodoxy. They outline discipline. And by having them copied beautifully, he makes the law tangible, a book you can place on an altar, a symbol of his power to interpret divine order. In that case, the scriptorium isn't preserving classical knowledge for its own sake. It's building the legal architecture of a church-state. The patron's need for control shapes what knowledge is seen as valuable enough to save, or a king like Otto III around the year 1000. He dreams of reviving ancient Rome. To legitimize his rule, he needs a link to those emperors, so his court scriptorium produces lavish copies of Roman histories. Chronicles that frame his Germanic kingship as the successor to Caesar and Augustus. The illuminations might show him receiving a crown from Roma or seated on a throne from ancient coins. The text itself, preserved from antiquity, becomes a weapon. It becomes propaganda, a tool to manufacture political legitimacy. The patron uses the past to secure his future. Even inside a monastery, the abbot was the ultimate patron. He allocated the community's resources. He decided which scribe worked on which text. If the abbot was a scholar who loved logic, the scriptorium might focus on Aristotle. If he was more concerned with pastoral care, the output would shift to sermon collections, guides for confession. The abbot's curiosity or his practical worries became the filter. His silent priorities decided which seeds from the past were watered and which were left to dry. These patrons were the planners. They saw the scriptorium not just as a rescue service for old books, but as a factory for cultural production. Every commission was an investment, in prestige, in power, in the soul of the community. They asked a simple, brutal question: what is this knowledge for? How does it serve my church, my kingdom, my legacy? The answer decided what got copied in gold leaf and what was forgotten. So the medieval intellectual landscape we inherited, its emphasis on law, its fusion of Roman imagery with Christian kingship, its very canon of essential authors, that wasn't an accident. It was designed quietly, deliberately by the men who held the purse strings. They were the architects, the scribes were the builders, translating a vision into pages of ink. The hand that writes history is often holding a bag of gold. The monastic scriptorium is a kind of paradox. It was meant to be a vault, a place for perfect preservation. But it became a place of constant change. The monks at those desks weren't just copying, they were translators. They were moving ideas from Greek thought into Latin faith. They were editors, too. They would cut passages that seemed dangerous, that could risk a soul, and they were commentators. Their notes in the margins, those whispers, they became a permanent frame around the old ideas. They were artists. They used gold leaf, lapis lazuli. They staged classical knowledge inside a new drama, a new kind of meaning. For centuries, this was a silent dialogue with the past. They saved the light of classical learning. They kept it from going out, but light changes when it passes through a prism. The monastic world was that prism. Its faith, its language, its quiet psychology. The white light of Athens and Rome went in, and it came out as a spectrum, still brilliant but broken into colors. Colors the medieval world could recognize, could use. Aristotle's logic became a tool for building theological cathedrals. Ptolemy's star charts became a map of the angelic spheres. Ovid's poetry, all that transformation, it became a parable for the soul's journey. They didn't betray the ancients by doing this. This was the only way to preserve them, to make them relevant, to give them a job in a new world, a world that had forgotten the Roman Forum but was building the Gothic cathedral. By reframing, by glossing, by anthologizing, they kept those voices in the conversation. They made sure Plato and Cicero and Virgil could still speak, even if their accents had changed. So the next time you pull a book from a shelf or call up a text with a tap, just pause for a moment. Remember the quiet stone rooms. The hands that ached by candlelight, the costly parchment, the precious ink, the years of a life poured into duplication. Our modern world of ideas, it rests on that foundation. Built letter by letter, patient, transformed, knowledge was kept alive, not in a sterile archive, but in a living, breathing community. A community that was always inevitably changing.